So everyone who's tuning in, this is a pre-recorded session with online engagement hosted by Mass Culture and the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Knowledge Centre. Mass Culture is a network, a cultural research network, and I'm Tara as the moderator of the session, a co-founder and operations group or board member of Mass Culture. Mass Culture's purpose is to ensure that all communities have the ability to mobilize and benefit from arts and culture research. And through a healthy network, we envision that Mass Culture will facilitate an interconnected Canadian art sector, empowered to reflect and make informed decisions based on robust and inclusive research. And Mass Culture's mission is dedicated to recognizing, undertaking, and disseminating professional research that is relevant to the Canadian arts community. By convening cultural workers and academics, Mass Culture provides a platform for knowledge to be explored, widely understood, and mobilized. And I'll get into the topic of today's session in a moment, along with the speakers that you can see on the screen. But before I do, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. Today, I am sitting in Ottawa while I moderate this session. We recognize that Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. Ottawa, and in every city, town, and community in which each of you reside, is still home to Indigenous people. We acknowledge that the reach of our work today extends beyond other traditional Indigenous territories. One of Mass Culture's guiding principles is reconciliation and relationship development, making collaborative action towards mutually beneficial goals between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. Mass Culture's evolving network has a long way to go. It's not a quick process, but one to pace ourselves in making connections and increasing understanding of Indigenous cultural knowledge and experience. In Mass Culture's infancy, we are beginning to honor this principle by better understanding protocol and Indigenous research frameworks, building new relationships and maintaining existing ones in every province and territory, and providing tangible resources for local gatherings and dialogue. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth for the resources that we are using and honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who have been living on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful and have much more to learn and to move on together. And with that land acknowledgement, I also want to offer space to some of our other speakers to provide a land acknowledgement of their own, should they choose.
So I'm currently in Toronto, and for those of us who work and live in the GTA, we'd like to acknowledge the territories of Indigenous nations, the Huron, the Anishinaabe Nation, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We are part of the 1805 treaty between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation.
Thank you.
I'm in Manitoba, and we're on Treaty 1 territory, homeland of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and Dene nations, and homeland of the Métis Nation.
Thank you very much. With that, it's interesting that we go into the topic of today's session, which is the Massey Commission. And this commission resulted in a national cultural policy document, a report from 1951 that resulted from the work of the Royal Commission on the National Development of Arts, Letters, and Sciences. This commission was struck up by the Government of Canada. And for those who are tuning in, we will have a link to the full report and the summary from Canadian Encyclopedia on the website. So if you do not know much about the history of the Massey Commission, there'll be more information there. As a quick overview, the Commission's work included 224 meetings across the country, 462 written briefs, and 1,200 witnesses, 4 advisory committees. It was quite a large scan of, at the time, what they wanted to consider national Canadian culture. The report resulted in the establishment, most significantly, of the National Library of Canada, now Library and Archives Canada, and the Canada Council for the Arts, as well as a review of a number of existing federal agencies and Canada's relationship to neighboring countries and international. There are a couple quotes that I want to pull up from the introduction of the report, just so we can understand the scope to which this commission between 1949 and 1951 was looking at. They say, whereas it is desirable that the Canadian people should know as much as possible about their country, its history and traditions, and about their national life and achievements, and where it is in the national interest to give encouragement to institutions which express national feeling, promote common understanding, and add to the variety and richness of Canadian life, rural and urban. And before the report starts, there is a quote from St. Augustine from the City of God, which says, "A nation is an association of reasonable beings united in a peaceful sharing of the things they cherish. Therefore, to determine the quality of a nation, you must consider what those things are." Those are just a few things that look at the sentiment of some of the writers and commissioners of this report. And with that, I want to take us into who the speakers are today, so we can use this report as a jumping off point to talk about Canadian culture today. On some of our prep calls, we realized that, of course, this report is outdated. The structure, the form, the content has changed. We realized there was much missing. So we're just using it as a springboard today. And the speakers that we have are, in no particular order, Ravi Jain, who is a playwright, director, and actor based in Toronto, Ontario. Ravi is the founder and artistic director of Why Not Theatre. Hey, Ravi. And I will also include the full bios on the website as well. Thomas Sparling has been active in the Canadian music scene for over 2 decades. He's the founder of West End Cultural Centre in Winnipeg and has led Creative Manitoba for the past decade. Hey, Tom, welcome. Kate Taylor is a Toronto cultural journalist, critic, and novelist. She's a staffer at the Globe and Mail, writes as the visual arts critic, also writes on film and cultural policy. Hello, Kate.
Hi.
And Zainub, who is an artist, curator, scholar, critic, writer, senior arts administrator, and public intellectual. And currently, she is the executive director of the Ontario Association of Art Galleries based in Toronto. Hey, Zainub.
Hi.
Right. So with that, I want to take us into the first discussion question. Kate, I'm going to ask you to kick it off. What was born from the Massey Commission? What did it include, build, and exclude?
Well, I think if you're looking at the Massey, I mean, it's more than 60 years old, right? So obviously, as you mentioned earlier, it's today it seems kind of out of date. But if it's worth, you know, resurrecting and looking at, I think it's worth sort of remembering the history it came out of. And by that point, of course, by the point it was created, Canada was, you know, fully immersed in the Cold War. But I think actually what a lot of the impulses sprang from was the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And Canada in those years, of course, tended on cultural policy very much to look to the UK. And there was a movement in the UK which has helped establish the British Council, which paralleled the Canada Council. Right after the war, the Allied nations had been horrified by the way in which culture had been turned into an arm of fascist propaganda by the Nazis, most obviously. And they started to establish cultural institutions that were that were government funded but independent of government. And so a lot of what the Massey was inspired by was that kind of model, and the British Council, but they're perhaps more better known examples. One would be the Edinburgh Festival, which was established right after the war as an attempt to sort of get people out of the war, and as a way of use culture to sort of advance society. The Cannes Film Festival is another example, which was a reaction. It was an independent film festival created in reaction against fascism. So that was kind of the atmosphere. And I think the really important thing that comes out of that you have to remember and is pertinent to this day is the difference between state culture and public culture. And what Massey wanted and what we have, I think, created in Canada is an understanding that you fund artists, you fund culture, but you leave them independent from the state. And so I think that's the kind of philosophy that, if parts of it seem outdated, that's the thing we want to think about and retain.
Thanks, Kate. We had chatted a bit as a group earlier around a particular type of nation building and how it gave way into some funding systems for institutions. Opening it up to the other speakers, different thoughts on what the Massey Commission included, built, and excluded.
Go ahead.
Tom?
Well, I think, you know, the CBC and the National Film Board, the National Gallery, these are all things that came out of the Massey Commission that are important. But it's really important to recognize that the Massey Commission was centered around two groups, the French and the English. So it's all very much Eurocentric. All of the pieces that were built were to sustain those kinds of culture. And so when we talk about it today and we look at the broad demographics and the fact that, you know, we spent quite a bit of time doing Indigenous land acknowledgements, and there is no mention of Indigenous within the Massey Commission. So while some of the pieces that came out of it are very important, there needs to be some transformation. Not that there hasn't been some, but federal policy needs to reflect the changes demographic, and then we haven't even started talking about digital at this point.
Zainub?
Yes, I think it's also really important to note that, you know, it was definitely a document that did not remain unchallenged. I want to point to Susan Crean's book, who wrote Who's Afraid of Canadian Culture, or Maria Tippett's Making Culture, English Canadian Institutions, and the Arts Before the Massey Commission. And there were many others as well. But I think there's two things that I kind of really want to point to as well, that in the years of nation building, the processes were in a way interrupted. And I think by the second wave of feminism, which was subsequent to the failure of the 1970s Royal Commission on Status of Women. And I think there was a huge interjection of, you know, racial discourse in a really intensive way that shook kind of multiple cultural institutions and that apparatus, because I you know, would like to make sure that interjected into this conversation is kind of the history of resistance and questioning of these kinds of policies and documents. And, you know, in 1989, Invisible Colors really kind of created, it was a film and video festival of third world women and women of color. And it was held in Vancouver, showed over, you know, 110 works with a symposium, etc. But kind of that really what came out of these kinds of huge events was, you know, the creation of like the Racial Equity Office at the Canada Council for the Arts. So pressure was definitely on, and I feel like, you know, that we need to sort of think about that historically, and then today, where will we come to?
Absolutely. Ravi, your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I didn't know actually about the resistance towards the Massey. I assumed it was there, but I didn't actually know about it. And part of why I didn't know about it is it feels to me that I haven't really seen any, I've only seen changes in the sort of arts community once Canada Council made big moves in 2016. I felt a lot of support, absolutely, from the Equity Office and Canada Council, but and slow changing priorities, but it didn't feel like a major shift happened until really 2016, which my company was a very big beneficiary of. And so for me, the Massey, I think that the colonial legacy really is the piece that influenced for me the arts. So there's a whole, actually, is it Tom?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole section on Indigenous arts in particular in the Massey Commission that speaks primarily of how, Indigenous arts really doesn't need to survive because the people won't survive. And, you know, the white man with his more advanced civilization and arts is clearly going to outrun this game, so let's not invest here. And I think what it did was create a reliance on institutions and single leadership, the colonial hierarchical models of an institution being the place where arts is created and where excellence is. And these words that permeated through to funding bodies really created a kind of exclusionary practice because it was easy to say, well, people of color or women or Indigenous folks, they're not excellent. They're not as trained or as talented as opera, ballet, or symphony artists. So it doesn't have the same value. And so there's been a real dearth of investment in those communities and those ways of seeing and being and practicing the arts. And so for me, I think the major kind of residue that we have a lot of work to do is how Massey actually has shaped what arts is in Canada and what we value and where power lies in the conversation of what arts are better than others. That's
a great point, Ravi. We talk a lot about, or we attempt to talk a lot about excellence and merit and what those actually mean and formal aesthetics and whether or not they're the right language to use, knowing that a system has grown and scaled up in terms of institutions as a result of these public infusions of funds that by the Massey Commission were intended to be made permanent. And this question
one more point, sorry to cut you off there. Just with this, I just want to flush out this point of the colonial kind of inheritance. If you look at all the major cities that we have, primarily for theater, you have one venue. You don't have a multiplicity of venues like in a city like New York or even Chicago that has like 250 theaters. So inherent in our view of what Canadian arts is one. It's not many. It's not about a competitive marketplace where many voices can rise to the top and compete. And that's like inherently colonial. It is the legacy of that commission that's decided to fund one organization rather than thinking about many voices and many perspectives.
This goes back to the notion of an official national culture and what does that quite mean? How do we value culture? How does the idea of the national culture relate to regionalism, and the grassroots community and agency within communities? Which takes us to our second question, which I'm now going to open up to, and I'll just share my screen again. And that discussion question is, the Massey Commission looked at nationalism and regionalism, culture spread across vast distances, and Canada's relationship to the United States, so the influence of our neighbor to the south, and also the UN, which in particular, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, related to international diplomacy, peacekeeping, etc. And in today's context, how might we consider Canadian culture through national, regional, and global lenses? And Ravi, I'm gonna put it back to you to kick off this question.
I guess I'll just throw out some thoughts. I think right now it means something very different to be Canadian, given the global context that we're in. I just came back from the Edinburgh Festival where I was, the only person of color as a presenter representing a Canadian delegation supported by the British Council. So even just like the reflection of what it means to be Canadian is changing constantly. So people want to steer me towards Indian artists versus, the British artists, let's say. I guess, the question went away. What was the question again? In today's context, how do we think about this? I guess some thoughts are, one, cultural diplomacy, just artists in an international context, that we go and we represent the country internationally and the values of the country and our hybrid cultures. I think that the cultural context today, we need to really think about interprovincial dialogues, that there are many different Canadas across from PEI to Vancouver. So how do we think about, as artists and arts and supporting the arts, how do we facilitate these conversations across the wide lens? And then for me, again, that's where grassroots is the most important place to support and think about, because that's the most dynamic area where culture is always constantly changing. It isn't fixed, and it's changing with the times of the people that continue to emerge and the voices that continue to emerge. So just some quick thoughts on that.
That's perfect. Actually, going from the changing demographics, Tom, we had an earlier conversation about changing demographics and how you're seeing that not only in Manitoba, but also in the West, in BC, and you gave some great examples. Would you be able to share?
Oh, I think I was talking about Bhangra City in Vancouver and the Punjabi community there that is kind of a worldwide market. They have a number of artists who tour the world and fill arenas, yet they're very little known in Canada, and they're not supported by Canadian public funding. And further, they're marginalized in terms of access to venues. So there's this incredibly vibrant community that has this culture of dance and music and food, and it's grown up outside of the cultural funding model. Yeah, so that's just one kind of an example of what's going on, and you can see things. I met with a filmmaker who has moved to Canada from Africa, and he was telling me that there's this incredible African community in Winnipeg who this is their home, but they don't consider themselves Manitoban because they don't see their culture reflected anywhere outside of their small community groups. So these are some of the things that I think we need to really look at, and how do you know, and a lot of these communities are off to their own. And I think that's a result of the Massey Commission and the fact that they didn't think about people of color or Indigenous art as being something that was going to thrive and survive. Yet the Punjabi, the Bhangra Vancouver is the third largest center for Bhangra in the world, and exporting huge culture outside of Canada, yet being unknown in the country of the birth of these artists. So they're just kids from Surrey, right? But they're not really known in Canada. So how do we address those kinds of issues and concerns, and find, when we're talking about facilitating a conversation across the country, I think some digging has to be done, because I host roundtable discussions. We did one last week on impact of digital technology, and I went out of our way to try to find people of color, and we did some roundtables to support those people, but bringing them into a group, bringing diversity into a group of discussion is a difficult task, I think.
Kate, I wanted to go to you next for a jump off on anything that's been said, or your perspective on the question around national, regional, and international lenses.
I mean, I think, you know, the Massey was a kind of a vision statement, and I think there were problems, obviously, right from the very start with the notion of certainly a unified English-Canadian culture. I guess there was perhaps more of a unified Francophone culture in Quebec. But that, you know, that's been throughout the history of Canada, of, you know, what does it mean to be Canadian? And all we can come up with is, well, we aren't American. And clearly now, one of the things about the diversity that both Ravi and Tom have been talking about is that internationally is perceived as one of our great strengths, that we are perceived, perhaps because of the appalling counterexamples right now, as being very open to immigration, open to integrating new communities. And so I think from a point of view of cultural diplomacy and what we do internationally, that's really important to us, and we have to you know, acknowledge that and use that in our funding, obviously. I do think, I guess, responding a bit to what Ravi was saying, was that you know, we always said we had this kind of hybrid model, that we're not funded the extent to which European arts groups are funded. You know, on the other hand, we don't have the incredible philanthropy, the incredibly rich foundations they do in the States. And there are some advantages to our hybrid, and I think a measure of independence and diversity is actually one of the potential strengths of that system, rather than that colonial, you know, one institution that Ravi was talking about. So you know, today I think if the single cultural model, the single Anglo cultural model, was always false, today it's collapsed, basically, right? And people feel very ambivalent about nationalism anyway. You know, you start talking about Canadian nationalism and people start talking about toxic nationalism. So it's so that clearly isn't the way forward. And often when I'm talking about Canadian content regulations over in the broadcasting realm, I try and say to people, this is not about having canoes and beavers on TV. You know, that's not what it's about. It's about making sure you're creating culture locally, and that not all the culture you consume is imported from somewhere else. And that problem remains. I mean, if the notion that we somehow make this single Canadian identity, which will be a counterweight to the US, and they're like this, well, we're like that, if that notion is false, the fact that we need our voices and a counterweight is only more important, as I see it. And I find it really surprising when people looking at the digital realm kind of suggest that this stuff is obsolete, because if you look what the FANGs are doing, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, if you look at that power, that cultural power, you're looking at a situation where, kind of paradoxically, since we all have access, right, we can all be producers, we can all put our stuff on YouTube, and yet because of the cultural power, because of those monoliths, the situation is even more dire than I think it was back in the days of the Massey. So I definitely think it's a conversation that needs to happen, and we need to look at our strengths, of which I think diversity is probably would be number one. Also, I think our dialogue on reconciliation is really key, and is something we can use internationally too, and encourage internationally.
Those are some really important topics, Kate, and I know us as a group, we had talked earlier about the changing modes of production, consumerism, digital globalism, and how that affects creators' incomes and even the agency on the ground. So perhaps some other topics to get to a bit later. Zainub, your thoughts on the topic or response to anything that's been said?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a complex and a deep conversation that we would have to continue, but I mean, to what everyone said, I'll just add a few things that kind of I made noted from what Tom said. I mean, this idea of, I agreed with Kate that we don't have a state culture, but we do have an official sort of stamp on culture that has been exclusive. The Bhangra thing is a fine example of exactly Trudeau's Multiculturalism Act, which never actually had any legs, but it was like, we've got the official culture and you can do your song and dance, eat your food, we'll have a festival to celebrate you, etc. So that's an old conversation. We don't have to go there again. I think also when we think about our future and the power at play within a neoliberalized global economy, what and how can Canada think of itself and its culture? What will that actually mean when Google actually owns the world, or Amazon, as Kate just pointed out? But just sort of historically, how I think, in Canada, we do have a system. And when the Applebaum-Herbert report on the arts kind of inserted Canadian culture into the continental economy, and then we kind of created an arts for the public good and art for the private good, or for the private good. And now I think another thing that we do need to think about, and this strikes me over and over again, is all of us who are here and exist with this idea of the public good in Canada have been now really pushed within the neoliberal economic order to do things for the social good. They're very different things. And I think that's a conversation that's not had very often. But if we are going to think about the future and reimagine, I think this is also something that we would need to think about, because the pressure really is on, are you doing social good? I see it in the municipal art galleries in the municipalities where, galleries are pressured to toe the line of the local agenda of healthy cities and social cohesion, and everyone is offering yoga and Zumba and name it in the gallery. Galleries were not mandated for that. That's not what they were We can critique the colonial mandate, that's a different story, but we have on top very complex things that are going on, and I don't think we are understanding the erosion of our agency and the idea of solidarity and the idea of community. We are just thinking about ourselves. I think I'll stop there.
I just want to open it back up to Ravi and Tom in case you have anything to jump off of what Kate or Zainub were talking about.
It occurred to me there's two things. One of them is regional discussion that, sitting here in Winnipeg, I'm often involved in national activities, and the vast majority are either from Ottawa, Montreal, or Toronto. And I know that's where the population resides, but in talking to colleagues from Saskatchewan or PEI, they feel the same sort of thing, that the decisions are made in central Canada, you know, the Golden Triangle there, and that the rest of us are sort of, you know, we're brought in as token representation. So there's the digital issue, there's the demographic issues, and then there's also the geographic realities. And I, you know, we haven't even mentioned the North and some of the issues that they're facing, but there's vibrant art being created all across the country by all kinds of people. I think Ravi suggested or mentioned something about amateur art being excluded from the Massey Commission, and I think that that's something that we need to also think about. How do we support art? There's a very long tail. You know, the theater center requires smaller companies and the Fringe Festival to grow and develop and maintain the caliber of artists that are going to be on the professional stages. So art has a long tail, is another point.
Well, yeah, and I guess I'll only add, I guess it's a legacy of the Massey Commission too for me, building on what Zainub and Tom said about the Bhangra city in a way, and the difficulty of bringing different people to conversation is there's been a history of exclusion, not only for artists, but for audiences. And so because those exclusionary practices are there, it just isn't a dialogue that people are part of. And again, it's, I think, because of the investment in a single narrative and that it's been led by those major institutions, who frankly have been led by, you know, in my opinion, bad people.
I think that will take us to what a new national inquiry looks like, to have multiple perspectives, that grassroots agency, a few different things that we've been talking about. I'm just going to share my screen again real quickly to go on to our next question, which is, what would a similar national inquiry look like today? We're not in 1951, we're in 2019. So what would it look like today? And what would an inspirational visioning document look like? What might it accomplish? What purpose? And I'm going to go to Zainub to kick this one off.
I mean, this is such an interesting moment if we can sort of think about what could that new framework really be. And one of the questions that I've been asking myself and others around me is, you know, do we now as a Canadian public understand the value of art? And can we have a visioning document that really places, you know, that we can really kind of reimagine ourselves and look at the role and purpose of a Canadian cultural policy that can really define the central role of art in society and put art really at the heart of, you know, the idea of the public good back into it. But, you know, I feel like that we absolutely do not know what the value is anymore. I feel that we're lost in that understanding, and I've often say in recent times, what if we took away all the arts? And I know the idea for general strike is very outdated, and I don't. But if we did take away all the arts, and I mean also the cultural industries, fashion, lipstick, jeans, for one day, would people value it? Would they suddenly wake up and go, yes, there is value to this? Anyway, I just put that out there because I think that what I think that this new framework would do would bring a whole set of different voices to the table. It would not rob artists and communities of their agency in the creative endeavor. And I really think that we would need to regain really, you know, across this country, a value for art and culture, just to get it kicked off.
That question of value is so important, with a number of different indicators we see everywhere. I think on one of our earlier calls, we said we're about 3 years behind the UK in terms of—
About 30 years behind, I think.
30 years, even more so. Kate, I want to go to.
Can I just chime in? Can I just chime in there real quick? I just think it's an interesting question, and I think that if you were to take away all the arts for a day, I don't think there'd be much impact. But if you took it away for a month or more, I think what you would see is people would do what they've done for centuries, which is continue to tell stories at the table, continue to gather, make clothes. I think that question is again from an institutional perspective, and that's the flaw, is that art doesn't happen just in those buildings. And that's the problem, is that we continue to look to them to be the arbiter of excellence and what art is and what culture is. And that's not where it is. And that to me is a really the destabilizing of Massey, that we have to retrain ourselves into remembering that culture is human created, human led. It's not institutionally led.
It's a great point, Ravi. Kate, I wanted to go to you next. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm very interested by Zainub's point that making the distinction between what's social good versus public good, and I guess I might suggest that when the pendulum swings too far and all art is about social good, that does in effect become again a kind of state culture as opposed to public culture. And I agree with her in that one question I've been asking a lot of arts leaders I talk to lately is are you concerned by utilitarian arguments for the arts? Because we're seeing a lot of utilitarian arguments for the arts right now. You know, art is good for you. Your doctor can write you a prescription and you can go to the art gallery and it will make your mental health better. And somehow this becomes the gallery's job. So I do think, and I think it's a balance thing, because, you know, the flip side of that, which I am concerned about, obviously, is audiences access. And part of what those debates are about is about bringing audiences in and increasingly recognizing that the line between audience and producer is blurring, and that the kind of flattening that Ravi is talking about is a good thing, although I don't think I'm as pessimistic as he is about the past and how it has worked. But so if you're going to look forward and say, okay, what kind of document would we need in the future if it were a document? One of the things I always feel when I go back and look at the Massey that really strikes me, I guess especially as a writer, is that it's exceedingly well written, and that government documents today are full of abstract language and bureaucraties and jargon, and they pussyfoot around and they'll never make direct statements. And the Massey's very powerful from that point of view, use of metaphor and that kind of thing. And to me, anyway, that points to the notion that you need you need strong ideas, and you do, without being hierarchical, you do need leadership. You do need people who are good at articulating those visions and articulating why we need art every day, let alone every month. And that it is in that kind of human impulse that Ravi's talking about, that it never goes away. So a new vision needs that kind of excitement and that kind of gleeful metaphor. And I think we do need it. And I think we do need it, to go back to a point I guess I was trying to make earlier, because I do see these monolithic cultural distributors starting to dominate the landscape in ways that, for example, in quite practical terms, it is becoming very difficult for Canadian artists to make a living, just because of the realities of digital distribution and the way that has impoverished musicians, writers, visual artists.
Thank you, Kate. Tom?
I think that's a really great point about being able to compensate creators so that they can have a real living wage. You know, that's something that we haven't been talking about, but it is, you know, there's tens of dollars to be made in this business. And so it becomes very difficult for creators to sustain themselves and to create art and to feel that there is a value to what they're doing. I feel like I spend much of my working life defending the value of art and culture to government or to the general public. And I think that that's a question that we have to get at. What is the value? What do Canadians, how do they value art? Because if you ask them, they'll say, oh, I love art. Art is great. And, you know, I read and I go to the theater, or I you know, enjoy fashion, or whatever it is. There's a value to it. But I started using the term, you know, valuing with your wallet. You know, what is art worth to you? Pull out some money, and whether it's your own personal money or it's public money, if you want art to survive, how are you going to see that manifested? And I think that's a really important starting point. I also wonder if it's about, is there the impetus that happened in the 1940s when the Kingston gathering of all the artists in Canada got together, which really pushed the Massey Commission to become established. It was artists who got together and said, we need to do something. And I wonder if the artists in today's society actually have the wherewithal or the, oh man, another meeting. I just want to make art. Is that, how do we stir up the artists to get this started? And artists of all color, from all regions, of all disciplines. That's just a thought.
Any other thoughts on this question around what would an inquiry or a vision look like today? How do we talk about it?
Yeah, I would say that for it to be extremely radical, I think it needs to be Indigenous-led. I think that would immediately shift, again, the history and address the history of the Massey Commission, and it should absolutely be Indigenous-led. I think that it needs to acknowledge the past and actually acknowledge in writing the impact of what that, the history of this country and that has done. I really think that thinking about what some people have said is it should involve audience. It should involve audience in the conversation. I don't remember reading audience perspectives in the Massey, and I feel like it should really look at everyone from corporate owners to why do you value the arts, to the average Jain, to say, what is the value for you? What does this mean for you? And what is its role and importance? And how do we address access, the barriers of access? And for me, I guess an inspiring document would really think about actually what are all the barriers to us to actually even engage in the question of what role art plays in our lives. So there's race, there's class, there's there's geography. There's so many reasons why people don't go to the places where art is, but they do in their homes and they do in their local communities. And maybe if the document, for me, really thought about what those barriers were of access, the systemic barriers and the things that stop us from engaging in the arts, or that have historically stopped us from it having any real, not any real relevance, but for it not to be so pervasive and relevant for people's.
Absolutely. I think a lot about networks in terms of mass culture as well, and really opening things up so it's not just the perspectives of arts administrators or policy wonks or researchers, but of artists and citizens and donors, and really making it as open as we possibly can. Before I close off this session, we do have a span of about 10 minutes. So I just wanted to open the floor. Is there anything that hasn't been said in this discussion, or any little insights that have popped into your head that you want to share as a final word?
I do want to really, it's not a new thing, thought as such, but I must really ditto Ravi on this. And I think in anything that we think about for the future, at the center and heart of this country are the Indigenous people, and it should be Indigenous-led. We cannot even think about moving forward in any way. This is what would set Canada apart. This was what would put us on the map in a major way. It has to be Indigenous-led. They are the center of this country, and they should be leading it.
Anyone else?
I might. Sorry, I was just going to add to that. I guess just kind of to echo that a little bit, because when I was talking earlier about sort of vision and the need for beautiful language in some ways, for metaphor. The one area of conversation that I sometimes find in Canada right now, you hear that kind of sort of higher purpose that would be needed is in conversations about reconciliation, whether that's coming from the Indigenous community or for the settler community, that you hear that kind of sense of something bigger going on. So yeah, I think it certainly has to be front and center.
I think probably tied to that, I would say you know, an inspiring visionary document would also, along with the Indigenous conversation, take into account the climate and the planet and the role that the arts and culture plays in that conversation, especially when we're talking about international, and international is such a big deal right now. So how do we think about and the geographic region, and how do we take those conversations take them into account when we're thinking about the role of the arts?
Tom, any other final thoughts?
I've got, I don't know, a number of different things. You know, if you're talking about, we used the word destruction was part of this before. You know, how do you move forward without blowing up the existing infrastructure? You know, Ravi's point about every city has a concert hall and every city has you know, a symphony or whatever it is. Is there going to be a massive investment of money that's going to support and sustain these entities plus new, or is there going to be, you know, do you have to redistribute the wealth, and we need to have a Robin Hood kind of come run in and rob from the rich and give to the poor? That's a real question. That how do you move from the status quo of where we are now to some new future?
It's a big question to come from the systems that exist to honor everything that is and everything that will be in some very practical ways. With that, I'm going to close off our session and thank everyone for a free-flowing exploratory conversation that stemmed from the Massey report. We do get a lot of questions at Mass Culture as to how we decided on the name Mass Culture for the network. And interestingly enough, it is a bit of a play on the Massey Commission. And a new decentralized way of having conversations, building this inquiry to open up space for local gatherings and dialogues for artistic communities to talk about the subjects that actually matter to them. And we hope that that will continue through the resources made through Mass Culture. But for this topic in particular, we know that it's a pre-recorded session. It's going to be on the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Knowledge Center. We know that even with a great lineup of speakers, there are a number of perspectives missing. So we encourage everyone, or if you're interested, to submit your own perspectives on some of these discussion questions. You know, should there be something next that comes out of this conversation, like an inspirational framework or a visioning document, or is it just a matter of continuing to have conversations like this? What might it look like? How do you think about the national, regional, and international from your context? And what things have been included, built, excluded over the evolution of culture in this country? So thank you, everyone. Zainub, Tom, Ravi, and Kate for joining us. And you can't see her off the screen, but Bridget, our digital gatherings coordinator, for helping us get all of the tech set up and organizing. And I look forward to carrying the conversation forward with all of you. Thanks, everyone.